What's up, y'all? It's Shuffle, and we are here to talk about the Darkest Dungeon 2 trailer that was dropped a few days ago because I am slow at making videos, but I am super excited because this is a sequel to one of my favorite games ever. I hope it's one of your favorites, that's why you're here. We're here to talk about it, and so we are going to overanalyze this trailer as best we can, and then I will start talking about some of the changes I want to see. Of course, you don't have to agree with those changes, but if you have your own ideas, please throw them below. Talk to me, talk to us, talk to the world about what you want to see in the sequel to everyone's favorite gothic, horror, frickin' roguelike, dungeon crawling, indie, whatever tag you want to throw on it game. First things first, we are greeted by an old friend, Mr. June. Mr. Wayne June joining us again to be the ancestor, hopefully for a long time. Even after hundreds of hours, I have not gotten tired of his voice. I wish he would narrate my life, but he is back.
In the howling darkness of the end, men will become monsters. But hope will ride with those courageous enough to carry the flame.
Next, we'll get into the meat and potatoes of it, and as I said, this is going to be a little bit of an over-analysis. So the first part that we hear is referring to "in the end," in quotations, and so we have to wonder, does that mean, is it an apocalypse scenario after you beat the last boss in Darkest Dungeon 1? Is like hell on earth just coming out, and now it's not just Hamlet, it's other places? So I could see an apocalypse scenario, and it also kind of references, maybe intentionally, maybe not, but one of the first classic lines that we're treated to in Darkest Dungeon 1 is the ancestor saying, "In time you will know the tragic extent of my failings." The next few things that happen are mostly visual. We see the stress symbol, which I don't think has an official name. We see that above the mountain in the falling snow, and it fades away. Maybe that means something, or maybe it's just there to be cool. We also notice that the party is outside, so instead of a bunch of dungeon delving, and even though some of the areas were kind of outdoor, but it was mostly navigating tight corridors, going to rooms, like actual dungeon delving. Maybe there's something going on with being outside instead, because now we're dealing with mountains and the elements. And then we also noticed that the mountain itself is not a normal freaking mountain. See, when I first saw this, I was on Twitter, and so I didn't have a high quality look at the video, and then I came home and I watched it, and I was like, oh, there's a freaking beast inside the mountain, and that is some pretty terrifying stuff to know that the mountain itself, or like a monster, can get that big where it's a freaking landmass. So it'll be interesting to see how we have to deal with something if it actually is more than just a visual. You know, if we actually have to go fight a mountain. How do you fight a mountain besides, you know, dynamite and bulldozers and crap? Who knows? And then we hear another line from Mr. June talking about how men can become monsters, and that could be, again, just some dialogue, right? Some cool sounding dialogue, because sometimes humans are the true enemy, but it also could be a reference to the cultists themselves, how in, especially spoilers, you know, if you weren't already aware that there are going to be potential spoilers, but in the Darkest Dungeon, the last set of missions, the cultists start transforming into actual monsters, so maybe that, whatever happens to them, maybe that starts happening to everyone. Maybe it's just a big pandemic, and we need heroes who are equipped and experienced at dealing with this, but it'll be interesting to see what comes out of that, if it's something or if it's nothing at all. And the last shot we see as we zoom away from Monster Mountain shows some reoccurring characters, which I'm assuming are going to be in the next game, along with predictably others, but we see the Leper, the Plague Doctor, the Highwayman, the Grave Robber, the Hellion, and also the Man-at-Arms who is suddenly left-handed, which is showing us that some familiar faces will also be making a return. Now that we're done talking about the trailer, we can move on to changes that I'd like to see. Of course, these are rooted in my personal bias, and I feel that it's a little difficult to improve on perfection, but we're going to try and do it anyway. The first thing I feel that could use a change is movement resist. The reason being, movement resist largely feels irrelevant, because even if one or two characters have it really high, the other characters that don't have it super high can still mess up the team order, and your movement skills that your party gets to correct it not only have to have your characters in a certain spot on their side, but also have to have certain targets available, like the Holy Lance from the Crusader. The next point is comparing it to something like Bleed or Blight, where those effects also have skills that can cure them, such as the Plague Doctor. They also have items that can cure them at no detriment to the party. So you just take a little bit of damage, and then you use a bandage, you cure the bleed. Meanwhile, if you have a really bad situation of party shuffle or movement order, or even turn order, if you can't get your turns lined up the correct way to use your skills to get them back in order, you have to spend an entire turn moving to fix it. There's no item that fixes movement, so it feels more punishing considering there are less ways to mitigate it, and also the resistance that is tied to it also doesn't seem to help as much compared to other effects that can hit the party. The next change is really straightforward and probably on everyone's list, and that's some form of character adjustment. It's pretty tough to say what should and should not be considering we don't have many details on like the combat system and such, but we're going to assume that the same characters from the first game are going to be there, and that also combat is going to be largely the same as well. First up is one of my favorite characters, the Shield Breaker. Nothing too crazy. I feel that she could just use maybe 5 more hit points just to break that 40 HP limit, and the reason being she spends a lot of the time up at the front line because of how her skills work. I know she has block, but she doesn't get an infinite amount of those, and they get eaten up pretty quickly, especially when you start having group attacks that hit the party from a lot of the monsters. So having her just a little more tanky up front would be really nice. I know that she has some other really good stuff like high speed, but her dodge isn't anything to write home about either. You know, it's pretty par for the course considering the other characters. And this is largely based in her trinket selection of all things, because she has a special armor that she gets when you do 5 of her nightmares, which is one that gives her an extra 33% HP and also knocks down her speed a couple points. But that character feels like a complete character once she gets that hit point boost. I mean, even that boost is really, really high, but it feels really good for her. And also, it kind of sucks that a trinket for her doesn't feel like a build choice. It feels more like a necessity at higher levels, because once you start getting into champion level dungeons and darkest dungeons and stuff like that, a lot of the enemies start hitting for upwards of like 10 to 14 damage, or they put on bleeds that are sitting around like 4 points and stuff like that. So she gets eaten up in a couple turns really easily, and she doesn't have too many defenses to deal with it besides her non-infinite amount of block. So I'd rather her just get, in a perfect world, just get a couple extra hit points, and then also, if need be, tone down her armor, make it maybe 20% extra HP or something like that. But that's a quick change I would make for the Shield Breaker. The next one isn't too crazy, but does have the potential for noticeable game impact, and that would be the Hellion. I'd give her 1 more speed. Nothing crazy, no HP, no other moves and stuff like that. I would just give her 1 more speed. She feels a little too slow for what her kit is, and at 1 more speed, it would help her consistently deal with some of the other frontliners, and also have a chance, if you know the speed rolls go her way, to potentially gib one of the backline with Iron Swan or something like that. But I would, I just want to see her with 1 more speed, man. Just want to see that Hellion just a little bit quicker. Next, I'd like to see a change to boss monsters specifically, where they don't have the multiple turns thing going on. And I'm not saying that they shouldn't have multiple actions, right? Don't get it twisted, but when you have multiple turns, that makes strategies like Mark not be as good. And there's an argument that Mark shouldn't be top tier, whatever, I understand that, but what it ends up doing is it makes damage over time comps way better. So the Fanatic, he sucks if I try to mark him, but since he has 3 turns, I can just frickin' bleed him and do a shit ton of damage that way. So I feel that a good middle ground would be to give them something that always happens, kind of like a lair action from 5th edition if you know your Dungeons and Dragons, but it's basically something that always happens at a set time. So it'll be like top of the round, this happens. So for example, the Hag's Cauldron could just fall under that. The Hag could just have 1 turn, but at the start of the round, she always throws someone in the pot, right? That's something she always does anyway, but this way it doesn't eat up marks and it doesn't make damage over time the prevailing way to take down bosses with high turns, especially later on in the DLCs and stuff like that. You start seeing more and more of this happening where monsters have, like the bosses have multiple turns. And so it kind of phases out the ability to mark or debuff and stuff like that in favor of just straight damage over time. So you always want someone that's going to bleed or blight, because the way the turns and the bosses operate, it's just the more optimal strategy. Next change, move away from high-speed backline stress nukers. It's okay that these exist, but every zone has them. Every single zone has some kind of stress nuker debuffer that has high enough speed to consistently go first unless you get a surprise or have some kind of buff or debuff. it's kind of annoying because it's like you have the cultist, the baseline cultist girl. She does that already. She pushes and pulls your team around, then she lowers torch and she stresses, right? Pretty good moveset. And then you kind of power creep on it. You have backline stressors that give disease or buff allies and heal. You know, I just want a little more variety in that backline, that's all. Crimson Court actually does a decent job of fixing this with their set of monsters. They have some variety in the backline, but that's DLC, and so my wish for this is that the vanilla game launches with that kind of variety as well, not just 18 different ways to stress out your party from the back before you get to go. For the next change, I'm pretty sure I'm in the minority, but I would like it if crits got toned down a little bit. I know that's not going to happen, considering Red Hook just buffed the shit out of them. They toned them down a little bit with the crits miss or whatever they were saying, but I like more consistent gameplay. That's just a personal preference. You know, it's not, this needs to happen or I'm not buying the game, but I don't care too much for crits considering how much other RNG is already in the game. It's one that I just wish got pulled back a little bit, but you know, it's just a minor thing. I'll still be completely fine if they keep it where it's at or whatever they do in the next one, most likely, unless it gets really stupid. And that leaves us with 2 more to go. Second to last one is I want to see some item changes. Mostly I want to see things that accommodate the newer mechanics that they didn't have at the start of the game. So back at the start of the game you just had crits and damage and debuffs and stuff like that, and later on we added armor piercing and stealth specifically. So I would like to see trinkets that accommodate that, maybe something on a character that, you know, a trinket that ignores stealth and gives like 10% stress or something like that, or something that has just baseline armor piercing, not flat armor piercing, but like, you know, ignores like 20% protection, something like that. And the reason is a lot of the, especially the newer enemies and stuff like that, everyone just has a little bit of prot snuck in there. You know, if you look at a lot of the bosses or the newer enemies and stuff, and there's still a good deal of them in the base game, the old game, the vanilla game or whatever, where just, you know, 30%, 40% prot, stuff like that, and being able to skirt that on your damage dealers would be nice. And the reason I bring that up is because of the point I made before with the multiple turn bosses, where it feels like damage over time is the most consistent way to play the game. I know that they tried to nerf stall, which is fine, I get that, and they're trying to buff crits, but it just feels like it left damage over time is just a really good and consistent build. It's where you don't have to rely on a lot of RNG. Yeah, there's the RNG to stick the dot, but for the most part it's pretty safe. And there are other obviously good strats that are still around, like super sustain, where you have like Vestal Jester kind of thing, or stacking crits, but crits is really RNG dependent. So I just want some other build defining trinkets that you can make comps around, where you have like, okay, I have a couple people in stealth at the start of the round. You know, it doesn't have to be the whole time. You just be like, first 2 turns you start in stealth like the monsters do, because they haven't put stealth on too many creatures, but the player only has a couple things that get you stealth besides ways to unstealth the enemies. But it would just add a new layer of depth to the combat, so the enemies could try and counter your stealth or your protection if you decide to stack that, you know, like Man-at-Arms. But the goal is really just to add more stuff to the combat to think about, not just your chances for crits and debuffs and your turn order or whatever. Just more complexity, right? That's always something that's fun. Just more stuff to think about, especially in a game like this that requires a lot of thinking. So I feel that expanding it would be a really good decision. And finally, the biggest non-surprise to ever exist, new classes. Who saw that coming, right? But yeah, new classes, those are always fun, more things to dissect, more things to play with. And no one wants to see their favorite class get cut, so hopefully that doesn't happen, but if it did, I understand. They could do something like, if they do cut classes, bring them back later for some DLC if they want to be kind of scummy. But yeah, just new classes, new stuff. Alright, that's the video. Sorry I got kind of rambly and long, but hope you enjoyed it. Feel free to disagree and argue with anything I said, or post your own speculations. Obviously that same YouTube garbage, hey man, like, comment, subscribe to my videos, because they're freaking cool, still applies. And if you're interested in seeing me learn how to play Darkest Dungeon, I have my blind playthrough that's like 90 videos on this channel. I'll link it below. You can go watch that. It's a different game. It's before the Color of Madness patch and before Shieldbreaker and Flagellant, so you're going to see a lot of it's going to look different, right? But it's still cool if you want to see something like that from the beginning. And in the next few weeks, I'm going to be working on Darkest Dungeon 1 content. I'm going to do some class guides and a tier list because I think that's going to be fun. And I will do my best to cover Darkest Dungeon 2 stuff as it drops because this is one of my favorite games ever. And I would like to keep up with it and share that enthusiasm with all of you. So thank you for spending a few minutes watching this, hanging out with me. It was a lot of fun. It's fun to make it. So I hope all of you have a good day, good week, good life, good whatever you're trying to have. And I'll see you later.